Welcome to Continuing Conversations, a podcast presented by VCU Continuing and Professional Education. I'm Connor Lobb, and on this show, I'll be interviewing different leaders in the field of continuing education. This week, my guest is Oscar Keys, the Multimedia Teaching and Learning Librarian at VCU Libraries. We'll be talking about how he became interested in media education, some of the work he does at VCU Libraries, and some educational activities he's interested in working with VCU Continuing and Professional Education to digitally badge in the future. This episode is part one of a two-parter, so enjoy part one now and tune in next week for part two. And I'm here with Oscar Keys, the Multimedia Teaching and Learning Librarian at VCU Library. So happy to have you on the show, Oscar. So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in media education, like a little origin story type deal?
Yeah. So I'm the Multimedia Teaching and Learning Librarian, which is a fancy long way of sort of saying I help people learn multimedia tools like audio and video editing software, microphones, cameras, that kind of thing. And also I help people who want to incorporate that into their teaching. So this might be a professor who wants to assign a project like that, and it works sort of across disciplines. So let's say there's a biology professor who wants to have students make an animation of cell mitosis. We would talk together to kind of figure that out. It could also be, an advanced sculptor master student who wants to do something with like interactive creative coding stuff. So we're there to support student success in all of their sort of multimedia technology needs. And it's one of the best jobs I could have ever asked for. And as far as origin story goes, it's pretty classic. I grew up in a very small rural area in upstate South Carolina, and the computer was my portal to the rest of the world. And from a very young age, like probably around 10 or so, I just got really into video editing and making things up, my favorite TV shows. And it was a lot of self-directed learning in conversation with the internet. And that was a skill set that when you were in a small town, people were like, oh, you're really good at computers. You should pursue that as a career. And so I kind of followed that path. I thought I was going to be in a STEM field for a really long time, but I really enjoyed the creative side of what I was doing. And so when I kind of figured out that there was this space where there was a perfect blend between media technology and art called media arts, that's what I went and studied off at school. I did my undergrad and master's in that. And during that time, one of my side hustles was doing summer camps on filmmaking, on podcast production, that kind of thing. And I realized that I really enjoyed teaching perhaps even more than I enjoyed making stuff. And so I would say somewhere around like 2014, I kind of made this pivot in my career to really focus on doing instruction and doing education. And then I was, really grateful to sort of get recruited into VCU's art ed department. And they were kind of like, we're going to take those teaching intuitions and really hone them in. And that's kind of where I slipped right into media education. I always blame Dr. Courtney Wolfgang, who's at VCU, and Dr. Olga Ivashkevich, who's still at USC, because Courtney used to be at USC, because they definitely were my origin story of being my first sort of dip into art ed and realizing that there was a place where these technical skills could be used for helping young people and people of all ages, it turned out. If you can teach a young person how to video edit, you can also teach all the way up along the age scale. So that's my big passion, is making those tools easier for people to use, because I know how powerful it was for me when I first learned how to use them.
That's very cool. So like in your professional role, you help students and teachers who don't have like the technical expertise for doing specific things that involve video editing and other multimedia like skills. You like sort of like you help them do that. You like show them the ropes in a way.
Yeah.
And you've always just been sort of, or first you were teaching yourself when you were a young person, and now you're teaching others. So you sort of like
Right.
really come full circle with it. That's very cool.
Right. And I think also because of the age that I was, there was a lot of in middle school and high school in particular, I had teachers who were really interested in assigning video projects, but didn't have the skills themselves. And so they knew I was really into camera stuff. And so
Hmm.
we would like kind of collaborate. So I think even my perspective of like what that teaching looks like in a classroom was heavily influenced by that, because it was never the teacher knows everything and the child will learn it from them. It was always this collaborative process. And that's definitely informed my teaching practice as well. Um, so, we're all going to learn live together. So,
We'll just all be picking up the pieces the whole time, and then
yep.
maybe something cool will come out of it.
Encountering error is a very important pedagogical moment. It's one I try to brace my students for very early in the process. So
That's one of the best lessons you can probably
yeah,
learn, right? Is
absolutely.
yes, this will explode.
Yep.
This is not going to work potentially, so just be strong and keep on doing it.
Right.
That's cool. So like as the multimedia, so that's like your, how we got here. So now that we're here, what do you do as the multimedia teaching and learning librarian, like on the day to day, like especially I suppose now with over the past year we've been dealing with this pandemic, like how has that changed what you've been doing, and has it made
Right.
it more difficult?
Well, what's super funny is I had my job for 4 months before the pandemic. So I've officially done
Oh,
my
cool.
pandemic version of my job
Right.
longer than I had it beforehand. Um, I mean, it was kind of a weird moment to sort of become like the Zoom dude. Um, that was interesting because you go from this moment of, you know, multimedia tools kind of being not quite niche. I think they were definitely things that like professors were more interested in incorporating to their classes, things that students were more interested in, podcasting and YouTube, those have been popular for a while.
Mhm.
However, it went from being this like thing I'm interested in, it would be cool if I could teach, or I want to try it out, to suddenly like a necessity, right? Like suddenly everyone
Wow.
had to know how their camera worked. Suddenly everyone had to know how a mic worked. And so the like intensity of needing that to connect was very different. And I think it's times like that where I'm really grateful that I come from like art education, and I come specifically from a background of like pedagogy of care. Like that's like care informed work is a big part of my teaching practice. And so it was like really burying it down to the essentials of like humans are wanting to connect right now. We need to make those pathways as simple and as easy to understand as possible. And so there was a lot of handouts and different things like that. And then on the flip side, once some professors got more comfortable with it, they wanted to push those tools in really interesting ways. I think I'm going to give a shout out to the dance department, because I think they had some of the most creative uses of Zoom that I ever encountered. Everything from like dance parties and pass the mic, and having a green room for their breakout room, and sort of using it as you would in an actual space that was meant for art making, was really cool. And and I think my big hope is that everyone doesn't leave this moment being like, I'd never want to touch a webcam ever again. I think we're in a moment where there's going to be an expectation that everyone can use these multimedia tools. And so how do we build upon that? It's kind of like, I would imagine, a very similar moment to when everyone could read, right? Like literacy
Hmm.
wasn't a thing we had for a long time that everyone had access to,
Right.
right? Not everybody could read books. And then suddenly we're teaching it to everyone, and now everyone can read books. And it means you get a wildly different range of uses and types of text and things. And so, you get more trash, but also you get more masterpieces. And sometimes the trash is the masterpiece.
100%.
Um, but so I'm really curious to see what, it looks like after this moment, because everyone's become familiar with it. Like I think of my 88-year-old grandmother who I Zoom with every 2 weeks. Like that's the skill she did not have pre-pandemic and now can launch. Um,
Right.
so it's just a very different, you know, moment. Um, and but I'm also like, it would be great to maybe work in software besides Zoom this year. Would be cool to start bringing back some of the other stuff. But I don't think this is going to go away. And so I'm very interested to see how people's media literacy changes after this. as an overall population, because suddenly everyone kind of knows what a camera and microphone does.
I imagine everybody could share, not everybody, but like a majority of people in certain spaces could probably empathize with wanting to use something other than Zoom on their
Right.
computer, like Zoom and YouTube. It's like, what else is there on this? But
Right.
it just occurred to me that so like multimedia just refers to everything that's like technologically based that's used for some kind of communication.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, the technical definition is like any combination of media, right? So media can be a text, it can be an image. So a comic book is a
Uh,
multimedia because
I
it's combining image and text together.
I love
But
technical definitions of things. There's yeah, it's like one plus
uh,
one, two.
I
That's
think I think it
multimedia.
I think it most oftenly gets sort of uh, used as a substitute for audio visual.
Hmm,
I would argue that like coding is increasingly a big part of that, like creative coding, interactive stuff, microelectronics. It also can include things like 3D modeling, animation, that kind of stuff. Um,
that's very cool.
yeah, so it's really anything that's not just words on a page.
Gotcha.
Um,
So
yeah,
everything except for books, straight up
right.
books,
Straight up books.
like Lord of the Rings with
It's
no
like
pictures.
I don't know if I would quite say book plus, but like it is things, but but that's one of the reasons I think these spaces make a lot of sense in libraries, because so many texts are already doing that, right? Like a picture book is technically a multimedia object,
It's crazy. I didn't know
right?
that.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
thought it was like digital, but I guess that's
yeah.
digital multimedia,
Well,
right?
and we've had multimedia before we had digital tools, which is like a wild thing to think about, but like technically like film cameras weren't digital, right?
That's
They
true.
were mechanical
That's true.
elements. Same with projectors, but those are multimedia objects or multimedia tools that can create multimedia objects.
I learned something very cool today. I just always assumed it referred to something that was like technological or like digital.
Yeah,
I
I think
never
it
thought
gets
about a
I think it
comic
gets
book.
I think it definitely that's the vernacular use of it, but it's really anything that's doing things plus each other.
So as a multimedia specialist, you can make comics and you can make
Right.
movies.
Well, I could help someone get their comic out of software. I don't know if I could make the comic, but I can like make sure that their thing is a PDF
I feel like
in print.
you can make a cool comic about your life and like
Oh,
science and
thanks.
sci-fi it with like the whole journey. I think that would be cool. I would
Right.
read that. But I would totally read that.
Yeah.
So you do a lot of like you're an educator at
Mhm.
your sort of at your little your GUI center. You're an
GUI
educator.
Center, very, very educatory.
Very educator. You should put that on your
My
email your
CV.
email sign off thing. Educator. Educatory rather. So with all the you do like multiple so you do this thing called Wednesdays in the workshop, which please tell us about that. And
Yeah.
you have some and you do and you mentioned we were talking before we got on the show that you do workshops with other departments. You're spider webbing out and you're just educating everybody and you're getting everybody multimedia educated, digital, not digital, whatever.
Right.
So what do you have like an overarching goal with all these things that you're doing as well? So it's a
Yeah.
sort of a 4-part question for you, but
Yeah. 4 parts. I'll try and keep them all together. So
yeah.
I'll start with Wednesdays in the workshop, which was a block of programming that I inherited from my predecessor, Kelsey Schaefer, who has what my job is at Clemson University now. Um,
Shouts out to Clemson.
and yeah, shout out to Clemson. Even though I went to USC, it's fine. Go Cox. Yay. But
Woohoo.
yeah, so Wednesdays in the Workshop is a workshop series that's designed to introduce various digital media tools. That's kind of the best way to describe it. So it could be to everything from, learning how to make a podcast 101 to let's get weird with synthesizers, or I don't know, make dancing 3D monsters. There's all kinds of things that we do. Sometimes there's invited speakers. We did a really one of our best attended events last semester was actually Emily Sarah's uh, Design with Disability in Mind, which was probably my favorite talk of the whole time I've been doing these.
Yeah.
And so But the big idea is like they're about an hour long. They happen every Wednesday at 3:30. Not every Wednesday. They happen most Wednesdays at 3:30. You can check our events calendar for more information. Um, and the big thing is it's just really meant to be accessible ways of introducing a lot of different things. And summer have a lot of attendance, like podcast 101 is very popular. Can't imagine why. It's not like we're on a podcast or anything. And then, and some other ones are more niche, like learning how to use a microelectronic or how to, do something weird with the computer and programming. But the big idea there is I wouldn't say they're quite catered at students, but they're really catered at like making the creative process a little bit easier. As opposed to some of my other like collaborative programming that I do. Well, maybe I should back up. When we went remote during the pandemic, Wednesdays in the workshop became a means of doing some of those like Zoom 101 microphone for instruction thing. And those were really exciting to do. And I feel like they met a need that was needed. I felt like they were really well attended. We got really great responses to them. But one of the things that we lost was that was clearly much more for faculty and less for students. But really, like Wednesdays in the workshop was always slightly more student centric. And so when I started returning the program back to that focus, I was like, I don't want to leave faculty hanging. And so I partnered with the CTLE with Kim Case to do a series that was just specifically sort of multimedia basics for faculty. So that's one of our bigger, more reoccurring programming that we do. And I think this semester we're going to be doing like inclusive Zoom practices in the classroom, which are like both like accessibility and inclusivity practices that you can do while using Zoom as a way to teach. We're going to be doing digital equity and assigning digital projects. So this idea of like, you want to assign a really cool project. How do you make sure your students don't bang their head against computers and have all the resources they need to be successful?
Yeah.
Basically, how do you make sure that your like tech savvy students don't make an A because they're tech savvy? And then the other one is like getting creative with Canvas. So basically like doing like design inside of Canvas and thinking about that in response to what can help information flow and different things like that. So those are very different than, learning how to use a Raspberry Pi or making a podcast and things like that. So those are kind of the bigger.
What's a Raspberry Pi?
A Raspberry Pi is basically a small computer.
What is a Raspberry?
Raspberry Pi is it's a very small computer. That's basically like this big. I guess you can't see how big it is, but it's like, it's a full computing system. You can plug USBs into it and things, but they're used often in installations or robots.
Really just lost it, viewers. I really couldn't hold it together for some reason.
That's so fine.
So
they're very cute if you want to check them out. Raspberry Pi.
I kind of want one now.
Yeah, they're really handy to have. I can't,
a Raspberry. Wow, that's gonna be a whole other pot. Wow, I don't know. That really is just kind of. I don't know why I can't get over that. That's so interesting. So it's a very small computer that you put
very small computer.
An apparatus to make it run.
Mm-hmm. That's the way to give something a brain.
So we all have Raspberry Pis. Some of them are just
ours are slightly more powerful than Raspberry Pis, I would say. But the Raspberry Pi is more powerful than the original space station, I guess. So that's fine.
Technology is so interesting. This is like the third interesting new thing I've learned in this podcast. Because I don't even know, but the first two, is it Raspberry Pi is a tiny and affordable computer that you can use to learn programming through for fun, practical projects. Wow, that's crazy. All right, I just wasn't. Okay, all right, get it together, Connor. Get it together. That was pretty funny. So you talked a little bit about. So what was the overarching? You mentioned the overarching goal, I think, or you're still. I've totally lost my train of thought with the rest.
No, you're so fine. So those are examples of programming that we do. I will just say, like, I'm also available to do in-class instruction. I'm available for consultations, that kind of thing. But the overall goal is really to make uh, multimedia tools accessible to any audience. Sometimes I need to cater that specifically, right? I would teach video editing differently to like an engineering class than I would an art class, right? I would, sort of cater that to these folks are like really technically oriented, and they like want to know all the guts of like what different things are doing. Whereas with my art students, they want to know how to play and break stuff and like get things going really quickly and sort of doodle.
So
And so
you teach them like different, like in Photoshop, you teach them different tools before others, kind of thing.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I would love more opportunities to do more instruction with some of the STEM folks, but I find that they ask different questions and they have different needs. And so either way, one of my big things is I love to get in and out of a program in about 10 minutes because I think otherwise you lose everybody. So like knowing how to get
Yeah.
media into something, how to edit it, and then how to get it out. Um, and I think how I would orient that would be different based on different audiences.
Thank you for listening to part 1. I had a lot of fun and learned a lot from talking with Oscar today, and I hope that you did as well. I really enjoyed learning about the Raspberry Pi computer, in case you couldn't tell from my inability to hold it together when that was brought up, and the pedagogy of care piece was also very interesting to hear about. So you can find out more about what VCU Continuing and Professional Education is doing with digital badging at ocpe.vcu.edu/badges. And you can listen to part 2 of this episode next week. It'll be released on our social media channels and YouTube, just like this episode. So thank you again for listening, and have a wonderful rest of your day.